It's awesome here today on Planetary Health First, Mars Next. Michael, the host, we got Dr. John Dalton, and he's not in Europe, but he's just coming from Europe. Yeah, at the health conference in Europe. You want to quickly just briefly introduce yourself, Dr. Dalton?
Yeah, Dr. Dayton.
Dayton, sir.
Yeah, so I'm John Dayton. I'm an emergency doctor. I'm involved with healthcare innovation, both on the funding side and helping startups. I'm very interested in how we incorporate new technology to fix some of the problems we have in healthcare. And great to be on the show. Thanks so much for having me.
Yeah, it is awesome to be here with you. And really, I think what you're working on, what you're really passionate about is so important, this AI, professional upskilling, what that looks like. Do you want to tell us a little bit about this journey? Obviously, it wasn't just one day you woke up and let's do it. Like, how did this come about?
Yeah, great question. I think a lot of physicians, when we train, it's so comprehensive and it requires so much of our life that we get to undergrad, we work really hard so we can get into med school. We try to be a very competitive medical student so we can get the residency we want, and then we focus on becoming a wonderful physician, taking care of our patients, but all the comprehensive knowledge that we need. Then we get out in practice, and I think a lot of us, as we start to practice, that's very rewarding. But some of us have a little bit of a shock where we realize, wait, I spent all this time learning how to take care of people, but I didn't necessarily ever learn how to run a practice, or how am I going to incorporate new technology or tech resources as I advance in my career and as I take care of my patients. And so right now we have a situation where there's a lot of physicians that are focused on taking care of their patients to the best of their abilities, but that's being paired with so many new resources with AI. On one hand, that's a little bit of a something that makes folks nervous. On the other hand, we see so many possibilities for how that can enhance our care, and so a lot of physicians are in a position where they realize, I really want to advance my career. I really want to help my patients. I want to see how this new technology can help. But there's so much information. Where do I start? How do I become involved? And so some colleagues and myself, we created these documents so that people could find those resources. So the first one, Rehan Faroki led the effort there to finding a bunch of AI resources. So you're a physician, you never took a class on coding, you have no idea how this is going to affect your practice, but you want to be involved because you have pain points that you want to meet. These are resources on how you can learn about that. And then I led the effort again with some wonderful colleagues on how to upskill yourself. Maybe you're a hospital employee, but you feel like you have a lot to offer advising new companies, or you want to invest in some of the changes, or maybe you're at a point where you're like, maybe I want to change my career a little bit and upskill myself with some education, whether formal or informal. What do those resources look like? So yes, sorry for the long answer, but the goal there is making sure physicians stay current, making sure we can take care of our patients, and resources to help us utilize all the new tech that's out there so that we can be the drivers of how we best care for our patients.
What kind of feedback are you hearing from physicians and from these people in this community?
So one of the in the discussion thread, one of the biggest thing that comes up is, you have all these resources talking about MBA programs focused on physicians, or joint programs, whether it's like MD with AI training or MD with informatics or data science. People are saying, like, how important is an MBA, and do I really need it? And that's always an interesting conversation in medicine. I have some folks that will do a combined MD MBA as they train. You have some folks like myself where I wanted a little bit of a career pivot, and so I went back to school and found an MBA program that would kind of cater to areas that were interesting to me, like venture capital, health, entrepreneurship. And so I got an MBA remotely while I was working. And so that's one of the biggest things. Like, what level of commitment's required to totally revamp my career? And if I don't have time for an MBA and I don't want that, what are the other resources that'll just bring me up to speed on how I'm utilizing AI in my work, and how I'm meeting my pain points with new technology?
What do you think is the biggest fear? Like, obviously there's a big loss of autonomy with the payers over the last 20, 30 years, even more so. But what are you seeing kind of this mindset with the clinician that that is kind of open and receptive to these things? What is the biggest fear driving this, you think?
Yeah. When more of us are hospital employees than we've ever been in the past, we are in a situation where there's a loss of autonomy. So I think a lot of physicians that were involved when we started using electronic health records have a little bit of a bad taste in their mouth, and they want to make sure something similar doesn't happen with the way AI technology unfolds and how we utilize that. Going back to when EHRs became a national rollout, a lot of that was incentivized by government benefits if you transition, that turn into penalties if you didn't. A lot of that was based on EHRs that were created around billing. And so a lot of physicians didn't really feel like we were at the table when that happened. No one ever came to me and or the group that I worked for and said, hey, we have this new tool that we're going to use. What's going to be most helpful for you in taking care of your patients? Instead, we were told, this is what we're using now. We were voluntold that this is what's going to happen, and this is how you use it. No one ever said, well, what pain points do you have that we can meet, or how can we help you better care for your patients? And now that we have all this wonderful data, let's talk about how you can incorporate that for long-term care of your patients. Instead, we were told, this is what you use, this is how to use it. Not only is that the case, you need to come in on your days off to learn how to do it. We're not going to value your time enough to pay you for that, even though it required 20 hours or so for training, so that you could use that. We were told, well, you're part of the system. You need to be a good doctor and a community player. And if you still want to work here, this is what we're using. So you need to do that. I think a lot of physicians see the transformative capabilities that come with new AI resources that are also becoming available now to hospitals and to practice groups, and they want to have a seat at the table. They want to be in a driver's position. They don't want to be told, employee A at hospital X, this is what you're using now. This is how you need to do it, and this fits our hospital's business model. We want to say, our concerns are fragmented data. Our concerns are longevity of care and getting information from other facilities. Our concerns are getting data from patients from remote patient monitoring products and incorporating that in their care, rather than relying on one static blood pressure when we see them once a year. And so I think a lot of folks want to be more involved in how this new tech is driven to care for our patients.
Yeah, I think I really appreciate what you're doing, because it takes courage, I think. And then also, it seems like you're doing it very smartly. I don't think you're like a political, like it's political in some way, but you are galvanizing a group of like-minded people to give them hope in a way. And it seems like the promise of the medical record has been fairly realized, and the amount of hours. And so right now, what do you see AI right now? Like, what inning are we in? What is the promise? I mean, a lot of these things I'm hearing, these scribes, you're ending up wishing it like you're almost, I mean, what is the time span? If we could just kind of get another bit of a landscape of the current state of AI and what you're seeing analogous
Sure.
to medical records.
I think we have to look at what the capabilities are being offered and how we can implement that right away, and what future opportunities look like. There's always the big sexy articles about this AI model outperformed so many % of physicians on their state medical licensing exam. I think that needs to be switched, rather than saying how do we use this as an adjunct, and how do we use this to fix the problems that we have. It's not going to come as a shock to anyone that there's inefficiencies in the healthcare system. And so at the very first, at the very end, I think we talk about using AI for operational tools. How are we maximizing our patient flow in the hospital? How are we fixing our schedules so we avoid burnout? How are we utilizing this to compare our care with other physicians, make sure we're doing the right sort of thing, that we're doing it within the right time frame, that our standard of care is appropriate. And I think those kind of operational tools are going to be very important. And I think this is where, you talk about working as an employee in a hospital setting. I think those are going to be the ones that are applied first and are being applied. You mentioned ambient scribe technology. This is fascinating. The ability for me to have a conversation with the patient, to narrate my examination, and to leave the room, and rather than spending the next 20 minutes writing a chart, facing a computer screen instead of my patients, it's building an exam document, a history for me, and that I can utilize later. I think that's great as far as connecting us with our patients, instead of putting us in a computer room, or having us chained to a desk when we need to be seeing other patients. So I think that's one of the things that people are most excited about. At the same time, you look at how that's being implemented. Our physicians, they have a seat at the table when a hospital group or a large, multi-specialty practice is saying, which scribe technology are we going to be using? And you also have to look at how does this integrate with the electronic health record that we use? But ultimately, the big question that should be asked is this going to improve our care? Is this going to decrease burnout for physicians? Is this going to make patients happier? And I think those are some of the big things, happier and healthier. And I think those are some of the big questions that need to be answered. Now, beyond that, you have new clinical decision support tools like open evidence. This is a phenomenal resource, and I'll use this often because I can ask very specific questions, give patients very customized discharge instructions and education based on their reading level and even their language. I used it last night to say, this is a Spanish-speaking patient. I want to know what's being said on the instructions, but I also want a version that's useful for them. And so we have a lot of clinical decision support tools that we can use as well. And so I think we're starting to kind of see the tip of the iceberg of what's available. I think coming down the pipe, we'll have something like large language models that help us, where a patient has kind of a living record with data from their remote patient monitors, data from labs, data from other hospitals all gathered together. And when all that's there, we'll see what kind of things are maybe slipping through the cracks, or we'll see trends that emerge, based on their kidney function or their heart function. And so I think that helps with longevity of care, as patients switch jobs or as they move. I think that helps with transfer of care as they move from one area to the other, whether that's a location or a system. And so that I think that's going to be critical. And then in a more kind of futuristic place, we can see what they call multimodal AI, where not just natural language processing with words from an electronic health record, but also imaging data from their CTs and MRIs and other resources where that comes together to give us, practice advice, let us know where we're missing, let us know that we're providing that best comprehensive care. So I think there's a lot of different components of AI, and I think you have to sort those out to, is this an operational tool? Is this a language tool? Is this an imaging tool? Is this a multimodal tool? And knowing all the capabilities of all those, I think shows us how we can meet needs with our patients and provide better care.
So what are you doing on your own time? Are you doing some no-code projects? What does that look like, your Google experience, that 20%, or maybe it's the 10% you do to just delight in these things?
Yeah, that's a great question. I'm a big fan of design your life philosophy. So I'm an emergency doctor. I work 12-hour shifts a month, and that's my patient care. That's my specially trained care. That's the time that I spend with patients. On the flip side, I'm also involved with advising new companies, helping them meet needs for physicians or hospital groups as they develop products. And then I'm also involved on the venture funding side, reviewing new companies that are coming to market and saying, yeah, this company's great. We should fund them. Where you mentioned the no code, a great example of that. My colleague Yair Saperseed has a company called AvoMD, and it's a brilliant model where he said, we're physicians, we have specialty training, we're not coders, and so here is a no code platform to ensure that you have a patient care pathway that can be implemented into an EHR, and so you can use that to make sure that on the back end, all the tech and everything is there, but that's implemented in a way that you can follow patients with specific care plans. And so I think we'll see a lot more of that. I think that's why AvoMD's been successful.
Yeah, it's very promising. It seems with the no code, the speed. It just, I think now it's putting more burden on you, the clinicians, to get. It's like, how do we balance this?
Yeah, that's the tricky part, right? What what's your passion? Obviously, we're kind of self-selected. We're the type A's that want to get through school, but that doesn't end there. Now that we're practicing, maybe someone wants to be involved in helping a new company, or maybe they want to be involved investing, or maybe they want to be, maybe they're just kind of overwhelmed with AI resources and saying, what's just a great resource for me to understand this. There's a couple different executive programs, that big programs like MIT or Stanford, where you can take those and learn different applications. But that's outside of our training model. We're in our books for first 2 years of med school, then we're in the clinics for the next 2 years, and residency we're rotating, and after you're practicing, you're focusing on getting your CME credits, and you go to a specialty conference for this, and maybe use an online resource. The problem with new technology is it's not yet integrated into the house of medicine in such that if I take a course, like I did the MIT AI and healthcare course, phenomenal course, but a couple of drawbacks for practicing physicians. It's time consuming, it's expensive. I don't necessarily get continuing medical education credits for it. And so a lot of times I think you have to go outside of what you would typically do when you're doing your professional learning, and say, this is interesting enough for me that I'm going to invest some time and resource to do it. Luckily, that's like on the kind of more expensive side. There's free Coursera courses for like Stanford and Google to kind of dip your foot in the water and get a taste and say, well, let me just get a little bit of information, or let me just start here. And so that was the goal with this big upskilling document, this AI resources, saying, all right, let's help people find an educational opportunity, or maybe if they're not sold on that yet, let's find a group of like-minded physicians. Like maybe we connect them with health tech nerds, or a Slack community with physicians who are interested, or let's find some thought leaders, and a podcast like Planetary Health First, Mars Next, where we're talking about medical futurism, and so we get folks listening to things that will change how they think about things, or move their career or their knowledge forward.
So how are you operationalizing this? I feel like where are you like on this as a mapping it out, and what would be your end goal for institutionalizing this need? It seems like you're realizing it, you're getting the resources. What would this look like if you were able to, this was able to become a full not-for-profit, or however this would look going forward, or organization or committee? What would be the end goal for you in the next few years with this?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mostly created the upskilling document, and collaborated with colleagues on that, and helped with the AI tool, because a lot of physicians that are kind of moved into this space, we have other folks that say, what are you recommending, or what are you using? And we thought, we always get criticized as physicians, you guys can't, work together to make these changes. And I pushed back a little bit on this, because I think, we're a bunch of physicians, different specialties, different practice locations, but we built these because for some folks, when you're kind of new to a space, other people falling behind say, what did you do? What steps would you not take, and what things have been most useful? And we have a lot of conversations with folks, and we realized, let's just consolidate these conversations we're having with folks and put that out. So these are just a result of collaborative effort with some physician leaders. We a lot of folks that are kind of thought leaders in the space help design these documents. Folks like Graham Walker, who started a company called MD Calc that all physicians use now. He very much understands hitting a pain point and building a resource for it. And Sarah Gebauer, who's an expert in AI and healthcare, and she helped collaborate with this document as well. So we try to find folks that this is an area that's passion for them. It's also an area where they've demonstrated expertise and building in the space, and to kind of build that in a collaborative way. I think the more physicians you have at the table when you're making a decision, and the more physicians that are informed, the better it is for us as a profession, but the better it is for our patients as well. So at this point, that building these documents, this doesn't have anything to do with anything any goal I have professionally, more than just trying to make resources available.
Yeah, I would also say that you were kind of saying, well, like talking about the drawbacks of physicians doing this and whatnot. I forget exactly how you said it, but I would say, to me, I'm not a clinician, I'm not a physician, but I am encouraged that healthcare is better when you have physicians doing this. On the other hand, we need physicians. Like I'm saying, clearly the physicians that you are kind of catalyzing, galvanizing with these other thought leaders, like a movement, if you would, that is essential to having yours at the foot of. Otherwise, you're having technologists alone doing this, and then without the patient, without the clinician's perspective, that is a scary world. So I see it as, AI gone wrong. If that 20%, whatever that number is, if AI's the singularity gone wrong or whatever, right? The AI gone wrong is when clinicians aren't doing what you're trying to do, I would say.
I 100% agree, and I think like a great illustration of that is you've been to Health and you've been to Vive. These are conferences that are outside what a physician typically attends. It's not a specialty society event. Up until the most recent one, there's no continuing medical education credits offered, and so physicians are reticent to attend. At the same time, these are the big events in the U.S. where health tech is discussed, where people building companies are talking to hospitals, where technology companies are making announcements of what they're rolling out in the hospitals. And I'm shocked when I attend these events how few physicians are there. And really the ones that are there aren't ones that aren't necessarily clinically practicing. Maybe it's someone who built a company and scaled it when they first found a pain point, or maybe they're a chief medical officer for a big group like Google or like a pharmaceutical company. And so it's really interesting to attend these events, to connect with physicians that are there and say, what are your goals and what are you doing in your community, and what's interesting to you at this conference, and realizing, boy, this feels like it's for everybody but us, and we're trying to like sneak in and get a seat at the table. Luckily, Nisha Mehta, who runs physician side gigs, and Adam Goodkoff, who runs Medpreneurs, physicians like that are kind of making an inroad where they're saying, hey, our tribe's gathering here. Let's create some education. Let's have some mentors who are at this conference who maybe have careers that other folks are looking at doing something similar. Let's having them, share knowledge and share best practices. And so, luckily, these are becoming a hotspot for physician innovators. But a few years ago, we were kind of on the outside trying to knock on the door and get inside.
Yeah, well, I'm encouraged because I think there's nothing more powerful than having clinicians, physicians building things, doing things. I mean, you guys you are so essential to, and I think like your prior experience with the medical records where you weren't there, you were just told, and it was, now sit on this for 15 more hours or whatever it is, the time, whether it be, I don't even want to know, the 15 or 20% of your practice time, on that bench, data entering, whatever. So,
yeah, I mean, just that. I mean, that's such a crucial example, because the EHR rollout was kind of sold to America, with legislation and regulation, like this is going to bring all the data together and this is going to provide the care, and it's like one of those well-intentioned things that the side effects of this are now physicians spend more time charting, and the term pajama time exists, discussing you can't get all your charting done if you're full day at the hospital, and so you have to go home, put your kids to bed, and then you're spending time finishing your charts before you start the next day. And this is something that contributes to burnout, and I think that's why a lot of physicians are very, very cautious about how new tech is going to be rolled out, and rather than having an outside locus of control where it's something that's going to change our life, we want to be at the table and say, great, we recognize the potential, we recognize the technology, but we want to make sure it's built in a way that meets our pain points and makes our lives easier and gives us more face-to-face time with patients.
So as on the venture side, what are some of these AI companies that you're seeing that are getting you excited? I don't know, like what kind of capital deployment or what involvement, but if you had, serious check sizes? Like, are they early size that you would be involved in, or would they be larger? And what are these technologies that you would like to be investing in AI and healthcare space?
Yeah, great question. I want to talk about that from like several different separate angles. I and incorporate that kind of with the broader discussion. On the very like smaller end of it, you can have physicians joining angel investment groups, and a lot of times these are groups that are focused particularly on healthcare technology, and with these groups you're finding kind of point solutions. Maybe it's an ambient scribe technology, or maybe it's a AI resource that's gathering data in such a way that it helps you improve your patient care. And then you go to kind of the bigger side, like in venture capital. There's about 25 hospitals in the U.S. that have a venture fund. For example, I do my shifts with Intermountain Health in Salt Lake City, and Intermountain has a venture fund called Intermountain Ventures, and they look at specific solutions that the hospital needs. And so rather than just kind of point solutions at that level, they're looking at things that are more broad and things that can be incorporated into our current tech stack to help our patients. And so on that side, operational tools are big. Things like how are we using AI to have more efficient billing? How are we using AI for scheduling? How are we using AI for hiring? How are we using AI for patient evaluation, patient evaluation to see of their clinicians taking care of them, and what kind of clinical decision support tools. We look at things like open evidence, where this is a big large language model informed on all of the best academic journals. And if you have a tricky case, you can look at that and say, you can put in the patient's age, give some variables and saying, I'm working up this patient, what are some areas I need to be concerned about? What are can't miss situations? What kind of labs and imaging, or things you don't see on a regular basis? And once you've treated that patient, can I customize the discharge instructions for them? So for example, last night I had a patient that I took care of at a kind of a complex injury of the hand. He had some dislocations of his bones. He had fracture that I don't often see. And so I was using these clinical decision support tools and consultation with the orthopedist to say, how do I bring these bones back into alignment? And what does this care look like? Is this going to be automatic surgery, or is there a way I can kind of fix this issue in such a way that's helpful to him? And then how do I maximize his care? How do I choose the right splint? How do I choose the right follow-up? And in the emergency department, a lot of things we see are very common. Your chest pains, your belly pains, if you don't want to miss the big things. But a lot of things are very rare. You can have a cancer patient with a complication from a brand new medicine that we're not aware of. You can have an injury like last night that maybe I'll never see again in 20 more years of practice, but I still need to be able to provide optimal care and fix that that dislocation. And so from that hospital side, from the venture side, what are some clinical decision support tools we can make available for our physicians? And so that's why you're seeing a lot of deals right now with open evidence, working with specialist societies, and because now they offer continuing medical education, this becomes something that like hospital groups are now purchasing. There's another one in that space called Vera Health, which is also based on clinical decision support. How do we work up a patient? How do we provide optimal care? How do we it kind of helps answer some of the tricky questions. And so that's something you're seeing on the venture side. And so it's interesting that it depends on the size of the company, how big the solution is, and how broadly it can be applied, whether it's a discussion with an angel investment group or a hospital venture fund. And then on the large end, you take a group like Andreessen Horowitz, their biohealth team. They're all in on AI solutions, because they feel like they're going to build these young companies, put a lot of money into them, and roll them out in such a way that maybe these will be direct to consumer patients, maybe these will be large platforms that hospitals will incorporate, but they're pretty bullish on what they can build outside of the healthcare system, but also with healthcare partners to influence the movement that healthcare and technology adoption flows.
And I love how you brought up the last one, Andreas and Horowitz. I think the other thing is just the multiples or whatever the correct word is when you're seeing, 3 or 4 team members or 8 team members or less than that rolling out a solution bought for whatever, making, a few hundred thousand AR a month. And it's so lean and like positive cash. I mean, it's just these things are just out of nowhere off the gates, a few months, and they're creating major traction, profitability like we've never seen.
Yeah, one of the interesting things that I was listening to a panel at Health Europe recently, and they were saying this is not like 20 years ago when someone has an idea for a medical device, right? A surgeon, they're working and they say, oh, maybe I could change this tool, maybe I can build a new tool to help me, with my surgeries. In that situation, they would, connect with an engineer. They'd figure out the best way to make it. They'd have to go through the FDA to get, the specific type of clearance, depending on, how specific this tool was and how it would be utilized. And so this would be like a major endeavor. And eventually, by the time they got to this point, they'd have, some angel funding. The physician would have connected with a business leader. They connected with sales. They would have, had a lot of meetings with venture groups and then potential buyers. The bar of starting a new company is much lower. You can have a physician that says, this is a tool that I need. An AI resource can fix this. So I'm going to work with a data scientist, or like we talked about, no code tools. I'm going to use one of these out of the box no code tools, and I'm actually going to build something myself. And so you can get a company formed with fewer people, fewer spend, lower spend, and you can get to market and have customers, and you can be implementing it a lot faster. And so, that's why people talk about guardrails, and we need to be safe and, make sure we're using ethical AI and, worry about bias. But at the same time, it's a lower bar to build a company that can be utilized, have recurring revenue. And obviously, you take something like this where a physician has an idea, they team up with a data tech scientist, and they're already building something that's helpful in implementing it. I mean, that has a huge potential for upside. You talk about, how many times you increase your revenue or build it or whatever your X is. You're starting out with 2 people part-time building a solution, and that's already implemented. The X capability for that is pretty astronomical.
See, I would love to talk more about that because I feel like that's the ecosystem you are creating with this upskilling, these resources, and the communication channels. As we speak right now, it's happening. There's got to be doctors talking, clinicians right now, early conversations through that Slack channel. Why don't we do? I mean, and then like to me, what is really the barrier to entry at this point?
Yeah, I think, and I think it represents a major shift, right? We can say like, oh, you're a hospital employee, just show up and do your job, but folks are realizing that, bringing something to market, you need the physician voice, and even if it's driven by a physician wanting to solve one of their own problems, that has more credibility than it used to. Going back to the Andreessen Group, BioHealth, one of the reasons that it's so successful is it's made of investors that have built something in the community, but two of their leaders are physicians with investment backgrounds. Sherman Lung's an emergency physician. What he buys is very informed on inefficiencies he sees in the acute care system, and then Benita Agarwala, is a physician at Stanford as well. She leads the investment, but she also takes care of patients. She's got a foot in both doors, and in the past there was this kind of the mindset like, well, don't be a dropout doc, there's a lot of community money that's is built to get you through your education, and you have a commitment to stay with your patients, and that kind of a funny mentality there. A physician that built something that helps the way other physicians practice, the way other patients experience care, obviously is providing a massive contribution to their specialty, to healthcare in general. And so a lot of that stigma is decreasing as well. In the past, these products would get to market, they'd get rolled out and realize well, physicians don't even want to use that, or doesn't even work in their flow. And so tech companies are a lot more cognitive to saying like, all right, well, let's really focus on our pilot, our pilot data. Where did we roll this out with a small group of doctors or with a practice? What kind of feedback did they give us? What kind of iteration did we make to our product as a result? And that's being looked at as not just like a nice to have, but a necessity if you're trying to scale a product and bring it out to the level that it's going to multiple hospitals.
So where do you see the intersection with health systems, payers, like not wanting to miss out on this talent, these doctors, where is that balance of that ecosystem to build that out in these next 3 to 6 months with this doctor that has an idea? Is there on-ramps for this?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think people are starting to realize that. We're starting to see, for example, we're just talking about Stanford, and this is where I did my fellowship. Rather than having your typical fellowships for emergency medicine, which are like critical care or pediatrics or toxicology, now a couple of emergency residency programs are saying let's have an innovation fellowship. Mm-hmm. Let's build some solutions in house. Let's partner with some local companies and some investors, and get real data. And so that's starting to be recognized as like a good idea. Stanford started one. Now Cornell's adding it. And in addition to that, a lot of these hospital investment groups are saying, we have, these brilliant folks that run our fund. They're, economists. They're, healthcare, finance, economics leaders. But let's get some physician advisors and figure out the best way to run our pilots, or the best way to figure out if this is going to be an investment, and especially how we're going to roll this out in our hospital system. Rather than saying, physicians, you are voluntold to use this. Let's get some clinical champions. Let's get them involved in how it's rolled out, what solutions it's solving, and they can serve as evangelists for helping their colleagues use it. And I think that's gone from a kind of a strategy of, well, you're a doc, stay in your lane, to be like, hey, you're a doc, you have some major insight in what your workflow looks like. You have a lot of colleagues across the country that you trained with, and you hear what people are using in other areas. What's cool and what's working. Where your residency buddies are, and so I think there's some recognition there. The other thing that needs to happen is physicians have just astronomical burnout rate, and this became a major issue with COVID. And so, in an ideal world, what I'd like to see happen is a way for a physician when they're kind of mid-career, and they're really good at what they do, but they're ready for kind of a next step is to have an ability to adjust their practice and to have some practice buy down time where they're involved with innovation, or they're involved with medical leadership, or they're involved with another process. Because not only does that utilize their skills and their strengths, keeps them it keeps them motivated, enthusiastic, helps them stop burning out, but also allows the hospital or the healthcare system to utilize the valuable skills that they have. And so I'd like to see, this is more idealized, but I'd like to see hospitals realize, boy, rather than spending $1 million to replace a physician that's burned out, why don't we utilize the skills of the physicians that we have and let them use their talents in a different way?
It seems like they need to create a not-for-profit, some sort of avenue. I mean, of course, most of these are not-for-profits. Don't get me wrong, but a sort of like Alaska, whatever they get a certain amount from their oil for their community, almost like a community benefit for innovation, however it's set aside. And it's and maybe they could easily do this with some of these venture funds. They create these innovation boot camps, however it be, formalize it, put it in, work with companies. I think what you're doing is you're creating with these other clinicians, physicians that are very much, there needs to be formalized channels for this.
Yeah, I think so. I think we need to have kind of a recognition that we don't want doctors to burn out. We want doctors to be able to spend more time with patients, which is what our passion is and what we train to do. But we also want to be able to help people shift and kind of learn, have ways to upskill when they need a career transition and utilize the talents that they have, rather than having a situation where someone goes outside of the typical medical education system. They're not getting CME, and it's not something that reimbursed like most hospital employees, but they're paying for it out of their pocket, saying, let's as a hospital group, let's send some physicians to this innovation conference, or let's send some physicians to Stanford's big AI summit, and figure out ways where we can utilize those resources and integrate it into our care.
What do you think we're kind of wrapping it up, but what do you think the problem is? Is it like the ROI thing? Is it the CFO mindset? Or you need a person dedicated to this? What do you think would help this kind of be realized at organizations?
Yeah, I think the biggest problem is tradition. And, tradition is usually a wonderful thing, but there's, very hierarchical structures in healthcare. There's very typical ways to, traditionally physicians are supposed to run their career. And I think the folks that can kind of break out of that and utilize, someone's background or hidden talent in a new way, or I think they'll find success. Another area that is of interest is a lot of what we do in healthcare is just based on, we do this because, it's good for the patient and we get reimbursed. And that second part becomes a major component. For all the talk we have in the US about preventive care, physicians are not paid, to have conversations with their patients about, preventive care. There's, you'll have your CMS annual visits that they'll look at screening for, did they get an A1C that's checking for diabetes, right? Did they get the colonoscopy? Did they get the vaccines? That's probably maybe the best place where there's preventive care. But I think if you want to change how people do something, you have to shift how they're reimbursed. And so if you have a large group of patients, a panel of patients, you having more flexibility with how that payment models and reimbursement looks, I think will really change how people practice. You look at these new value-based care models where they have a panel of patients, they have so much money, and they say, hey, listen, rather than spending all our money on, ICU visits when our diabetic patients have major infections, or they're not taking their medicine and they end up needing acute care, why don't we spend that money on glucose monitors? Mm-hmm. And why don't we put that focus on addressing, diet education or exercise education? And why aren't we utilizing that many things that keep them out of the hospital? Of course, you're going to have diabetic complications and things that require hospitalizations, but really the focus should be on reimbursement for keeping folks out of the hospital, keeping folks healthier. And so I think the biggest things, when we're up against how do we change things, I think you have to change what a traditional physician career looks like. I think you have to change what the relationship between physicians and the C-suite at a hospital looks like. I think you have to change how care is reimbursed, because that's how it's going to be practiced. And so I think that becomes like a health policy structure change. It becomes a hospital, funding relationship, hierarchical change. And so I think there's a lot of opportunities, because there are a lot of things that need to be fixed. But I think that's where you're going to get fundamental change rather than kind of like incremental issues.
Yes, a big policy change, and hopefully there will be some more of that. But then also maybe, from the investment side, realizing that there's an opportunity to utilize this talent, this physician talent, for the innovation arm. But
one great example of that, in 2021, everyone was stoked about digital health and the potential that was there, and yet all these companies raised a ton of money. And unfortunately, a lot of those companies, don't exist today because they didn't focus on, reimbursement in the current model, right? They had a great idea, but it never got through FDA clearance, or it never was proved useful enough or cost saving enough that they could get coverage through the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid, which will drive what private insurance does. Over the last year, this is kind of a big highlight. We've seen Omada and Hinge Health actually become very profitable, realizing how to use reimbursement within the system to focus on preventive and chronic care. And now they're kind of setting a standard for how these companies can work and how they can be integrated in healthcare. So I think looking at the folks that are able to work within the system, but also work in an innovative way and address it in a different way, I think that both of those show a lot of opportunities. So I think that's kind of what the future can look like: different payment models, different preventive care models, and changing the mindset of how that care is practiced.
Well, John, it's been awesome having you on. I really appreciate your time, sharing everything you're working on and doing. As we wrap it up, is there anything you want to leave our audience with, how they can find you, what you're up to, where?
Oh, yeah, I appreciate that. I'm on LinkedIn. That's the best way to find me. I try to attend, conferences outside of these normal physician conferences like we've talked about, and leave highlights. I try to put resources on that are useful for folks, and so that's a great place to find me.
Cool. Well, thank you so much for coming on. I really appreciate this conversation.
Absolutely. Pleasure for me. Thank you, Michael.